On October 17, 2019, Beirut didn't look like a country about to collapse. It looked like any other busy evening. Traffic horned in frustration, cafes clinked glasses, and bank signs still glowed like temples. The common belief is that Lebanon fell because of politics, sects, and bad luck. But Lebanon didn't lose to chaos. It lost to the ledger, the balance sheet, and the math of insolvency. Here's the inversion that hurts. Lebanon didn't wake up one morning and discover it was poor. It woke up and discovered it was bankrupt. Not metaphorically bankrupt, literally. A nation can survive bombings and still function. But when the banking system becomes a state-sponsored vacuum cleaner, sucking in dollars to keep a peg alive, you don't get a recession. You get a disappearance. Picture a depositor on an ordinary weekday. They aren't rich. They're careful. They saved in a land where saving is supposed to be sacred. They open an app and see a number that looks like safety. $200,000. A small fortress. But when they ask for a few hundred in cash, the bank smiles and offers crumbs in local paper at a rate that feels like a joke. That moment is not a crisis. It is a diagnosis. The screen shows wealth, but the vault holds air. That's what insolvency looks like when it wears a suit. It's a balance sheet with makeup on. It's bankruptcy without the honesty of the word. Think about the scale of the con. A Ponzi scheme is usually a man in an office, selling dreams to a few thousand victims. Lebanon's version wore the flag. It used central bank language and patriotic slogans. It recruited an entire diaspora, millions of people, and asked them to deposit their futures. And the greatest trick was simple. It wasn't secrecy. It was normality. It was the idea that the bank would always open tomorrow. It was the idea that a dollar in Beirut was the same dollar in New York. It was the idea that stability is a feeling, not a reserve. In the 1990s, Lebanon was a nation crawling out of a civil war's rubble. Streets carried scars. Concrete wore bullet holes like old bruises. But the country had something powerful: reputation. It had commerce, education, and the kind of global diaspora network other nations would kill for. Lebanon sold the world a story that it was a phoenix. At the center of that story stood a currency promise. In 1997, the Lebanese pound was pegged near 1,500 to the dollar. That number became religion. It turned uncertainty into a price tag. For years, you could pay in dollars or pounds and nobody flinched. Shops made change like it was the most natural thing in the world. That peg did more than stabilize. It seduced. It made imported goods feel affordable. It made rents feel predictable. It made Beirut feel like a place where the war had ended forever. And in a country that has always lived under the shadow of tomorrow, predictability is a narcotic. At the peak of the illusion, Lebanon glittered. Rooftop bars, designer storefronts, weddings that looked like movie sets. Banks displayed marble floors and polished counters, like cathedrals for money. The country wore luxury the way a man wears a good suit to hide a wound. But beneath the surface, the foundation was rotting. Because the prosperity wasn't being built by factories, exports, and productivity. It was being built by deposits. It was being built by cash coming in from the outside, then recycled in a circle, then advertised as growth. Here is the addiction, and it is deadly in every country that tries it. Lebanon became addicted to foreign currency inflows, especially diaspora dollars. Those dollars were not treated as a bridge to build real industry. They were treated as oxygen for a peg. The moment the oxygen supply weakened, the patient would suffocate. Debt in this story is not an abstract number. Debt is a living creature. It is a monster that feeds daily. It demands interest. It demands rollover. It demands new money to pay old promises. And when a country trains its entire banking sector to feed that monster, the monster grows fat and impossible to kill. The antagonist isn't a foreign army. It isn't a single politician. It's the bondholders. It's the deposit base. It's the market's cold refusal to fund fantasies forever. The enemy is the moment when new dollars stop arriving, because then the old dollars must be revealed. And there aren't enough. Lebanon's banks offered interest rates that sounded like heaven: 5%, 7%. Then double digits on dollar deposits, at times reaching 10%, 12%, even 15% in some offers. In a world where dollar rates were often near zero, Lebanon's offers were sirens singing into the fog. People heard high return and translated it as high confidence. Let that number sink in. If you are paying 10% on dollars, you must earn more than 10% on dollars. Not on paper. In reality. With cash flow. With profits that can be paid in hard currency. That requires productive investments, exports, or a booming economy. Lebanon had none of those at sufficient scale. So where did the yield come from? The same place it always comes from in a Ponzi structure. It came from the next depositor. It came from the next transfer from abroad. It came from new inflows that allowed old liabilities to be serviced without admitting the truth. The banks took dollars and handed them to the state, directly or indirectly, because the state was the biggest borrower in town. The state spent with the confidence of a man using someone else's credit card. Salaries, patronage, bloated public contracts, all of it lubricated by borrowed dollars and a fixed exchange rate that pretended nothing was happening. This is where the ledger begins to look like crime fiction. A bank's balance sheet is supposed to show diversification, mortgages, small business loans, productive ventures. In Lebanon, much of the system concentrated into one exposure: the state and the central bank. It was like lending your entire life savings to one gambler, then calling it prudence. By the early 2010s, the environment started turning hostile. Syria's war erupted next door in 2011, and the region's risk perception changed. Tourism weakened, investment flows cooled, Gulf support became less reliable. The inflow of fresh dollars slowed, and the system began to show tremors. A healthy economy adjusts. It devalues. It reforms. It breaks bad habits. But a pegged system built on credibility cannot easily admit weakness, because once you admit weakness, confidence cracks. And when confidence cracks, the run begins. So the system chose denial. It chose engineering. It chose the financial equivalent of adding perfume to a corpse. Around 2016, the central bank ran operations widely described as financial engineering, designed to attract and retain dollars, and to keep the peg appearing intact. The mechanics are complicated, but the logic is brutally simple. The central bank needed dollars to defend the peg. Commercial banks held dollars through deposit inflows, so the central bank offered them extraordinary profits, incentives that looked like free money. Banks would move dollars to the central bank, and in return, they would receive generous returns, sometimes booked quickly, sometimes structured through swaps and instruments that made profits appear instantly. This is the point where the documentary turns noir. In a noir story, the detective sees the same name on every document, the same signature, the same pattern. In Lebanon, it was the circular motion of money. Pounds became dollars, dollars became promises, promises became profit on paper, paper profit became bonuses, dividends, and political comfort. If you want an analogy, imagine lending someone a bucket of water in a burning building. They pour it into your own bucket, hand it back, and you both write down, hydration achieved. The fire is still raging. The water never increased. But the ledger looks calm. As the timeline moved forward, the dependency grew stronger. The banks became more exposed to the central bank. The central bank became more exposed to the state. The state became more addicted to borrowing. The system became a tower made of receipts. The rule of three arrived like footsteps in an empty hallway. The reserves were thinning. The credit was tightening. The political class refused reform, and the public, watching the shining shop windows, still believed the vaults were full. By 2019, the pressure was unbearable. That year, Lebanon's debt was often described at levels around $90 billion, a mountain for a small economy. Meanwhile, foreign currency inflows were no longer enough to feed the machine. The peg, the sacred 1,500, had become a lie that needed constant sacrifice. Then came the spark that revealed the gasoline. In October 2019, the government floated new taxes, including a proposed charge linked to internet calls, the kind of move that signaled desperation. People didn't erupt because the fee was huge. They erupted because the fee told them the truth. The state was hunting coins under the couch cushions because the treasury was empty. Protests surged across the country. Streets filled. Slogans crossed sectarian lines. And behind the loud anger, a quieter event occurred, one that mattered more than any chant. The banks closed their doors. When banks close, they are confessing without speaking. They are saying, "We cannot meet withdrawals." They are saying, "Liquidity is gone." They are saying, "If you come in, the illusion ends." In Lebanon, the closures were not just a pause. They were a bridge to a new reality. When banks reopened, withdrawal limits appeared like prison bars. People discovered they could not freely access their own deposits. Transfers abroad became restricted. Cards stopped working for international transactions. Businesses that relied on imports struggled because imports require dollars, not patriotic speeches. This was the moment the public met the balance sheet, not in a newspaper, not in an IMF report, in their own hands, in the absence of cash. The exchange rate began to split. The official rate clung to the old story. The street rate told the new one. Suddenly, there were multiple Lebanons, each priced differently. And in that gap between rates, wealth was amputated. A new word entered the bloodstream. Lollers, a dark nickname for trapped dollar deposits inside Lebanese banks. They looked like dollars on a screen, but behaved like something else. You could not wire them out. You could not withdraw them as real dollars. They were a promise the system could not honor. Think about what that means. A currency is trust. A deposit is trust. When a deposit becomes a different species depending on whether it's inside or outside a bank, the system has broken at the molecular level. The ledger is lying, and everyone knows it. The haircut arrived without legislation, without ceremony. In many cases, depositors were allowed to withdraw their dollar deposits only in Lebanese pounds at an exchange rate that sat far below the street price. That gap was the blade. It turned savings into confetti, slowly, day by day. You'd ask for $1,000. You'd receive pounds valued at a rate the bank chose. By the time you converted at the real street rate, your $1,000 had become a few hundred in real value. The rest vanished into the system's black hole. Not stolen with a gun, stolen with a calculator. It was a theft, quiet, bureaucratic, daily. And here is why this structure feels like a Ponzi scheme on a national scale. In a classic Ponzi, the organizer pays early investors using the money of later investors. In Lebanon, the system paid obligations using fresh inflows and accounting maneuvers, while the underlying engine did not generate enough real dollars. When inflows slowed, the system could not pay everyone. So it chose who would suffer. The poor and middle class took the haircut because they needed liquidity to live. The connected moved money earlier or found ways around restrictions. The ledger, again, was not neutral. It was a weapon used by those who understood it first. Then came August 4, 2020. Beirut's port explosion tore through the city, a horror layered onto an already collapsing economy. Buildings shattered, lives ended, businesses were ripped apart. And the tragedy's economic meaning was cruel. The port is a lifeline for imports, and Lebanon depends heavily on imports for food, fuel, and medicine. A nation already short on dollars lost critical infrastructure. A nation already suffocating lost more oxygen. In a thriller, this is where the protagonist realizes the killer wasn't finished. The blast wasn't the origin of collapse, but it accelerated the bleeding. After that, daily life grew colder, darker, and more humiliating. Electricity became scarce, and families leaned on private generators. Fuel shortages created lines that looked like scenes from a war zone. Prices surged. Salaries paid in pounds became jokes. The social contract disintegrated because the state could no longer deliver basic services. Here is the climax, the default, the moment money runs out. Not just dollars in vaults, the idea of money itself. When a currency collapses, prices rewrite themselves hourly. Bread becomes a luxury. Medicine becomes a hunt. Every family becomes its own central bank, hiding cash, trading favors, cutting meals. Sovereignty is solvency. Say it slowly, because it is the core of this story. A country can fly flags and give speeches, but if it cannot honor deposits, pay imports, and maintain trust, it is no longer sovereign. It is managed by whoever holds the cash. Now we zoom into the smoking gun moment. In many collapses, there is a treaty or decree. In Lebanon, the smoking gun is less romantic and more terrifying. It is the unofficial nature of the controls, the improvised rules, the reality that the system changed the terms after taking the money. The foreclosure happened in slow motion, not with a court auction, but with withdrawal limits and dual exchange rates. The liquidation sale wasn't on a stage. It was at every teller window, where the depositor learned that their dollars were discounted, while the bank reduced its liabilities at the depositor's expense. If you could hear the negotiation behind closed doors, it would sound like this. The depositor says, "This is my money." The banker replies, "This is our survival." The politician whispers, "Delay everything." And the market, cold and silent, says, "Pay in real dollars or don't pay at all." The ledger decided the outcome. Not the speeches, not the slogans. In the years after, Lebanon's economy morphed into a cash-driven, dollarized shadow world. Some people received fresh dollars from abroad and lived in a different reality, buying services cheaply. Others were trapped in local wages that couldn't catch inflation. Two countries shared one map. Remittances became life support. Money transfer shops became arteries. Cash became king, but cash economies also invite darker trades, because cash has no memory, no audit, no trail. When the banking system dies, a nation can become a laundromat, whether it wants to or not. And now we reach the generational aftermath, the long scar. In many historic debt tragedies, nations spend decades paying off the bill. In Lebanon, the cruel twist is that the bill is paid by erasing the middle class, not by writing checks. The debt doesn't get honored in a dignified way. It gets dissolved by inflation and depreciation. If you are looking for the year when the final check was written, you will be disappointed because the story isn't finished. The tragedy is still active. But the generational scar is already clear. Families changed their life plans, sold assets, emigrated, or accepted a smaller future. Doctors left, engineers left, teachers left. The human capital drained out. The one resource that can't be printed. That is the real cost. Not only lost money, lost time, lost talent, lost faith. So what is the real truth about Lebanon's economy? It wasn't a sudden accident. It was an extended addiction to borrowed dollars and impossible interest. It was a state that treated deposits like a resource mine. It was banks that acted like funnels into the central bank. It was a peg defended like a holy relic, long after the reserves were no longer holy. If this sounds distant, don't get comfortable. This is not a Lebanon-only lesson. Any system that promises stability without showing reserves is flirting with disaster. Any bank offering absurd yields is asking you to ignore the smell of smoke. Any political class that refuses reform while borrowing more is writing a tragedy in accounting ink. History is not decided by armies or politicians. It is decided by accountants, debt, and resources. It is decided by what can be paid, what can be imported, what can be rolled over, and what finally cannot. The ledger always collects. If you want to stay ahead of the next collapse, subscribe to the channel. Because most people watch flags and speeches. We watch the balance sheet. We watch the debts pile up like bodies in a dark alley. And we call the ending before the credits roll. In the comments, tell me this. Was Lebanon's collapse a masterpiece of engineering or a slow-motion robbery dressed as policy? And when you hear a government say, "Everything is stable," ask one question. Where are the dollars?